So this is the lecture on explaining deviant behavior, which is for Wednesday. I want you to make sure that while you take your notes, you write 2 questions to bring to class on Wednesday for the discussion. And again, this shouldn't take terribly long, but make sure that you have your copies of the Heckert's Deviance Topology and Tittle and Paternoster's American Norms and the list of the paired types of deviance that we talked about on Monday's lecture, just so that you can use that for continual analysis as we go through this semester. Okay. So today we're talking about explaining deviant behavior. And what is deviance again? Remember we talked about this in class, and in case you're watching this before you came to Monday's lecture, I'm not going to define it right now, but I will give you this. Some sociologists say that deviance is the violation of any social rule. Others say, no, it has to violate and then provoke some kind of a response for it to be deviant. There has to be some kind of indication of disapproval or anger. Some say you can be deviant just because your body doesn't conform to the social expectations that your culture has. Like, if you're fat, you're automatically deviant. If you're disabled, you're automatically deviant. If you're mentally ill, you're automatically deviant. If you're tattooed or if you have piercings, then you're automatically deviant. And others argue that deviance can be positive, just like the Heckerts did in the previous lecture. Other theories say, like labeling theory says, it's just about being labeled deviant. It's not necessarily anything you did. We just decided that you're deviant because we don't like you, or we don't like the fact that you can't conform to certain things in certain ways. And power is also an issue. Who has the power to say something is deviant or not deviant? So there are 2 main perspectives on how we explain what is deviant. The first one is scientific, and the second one is semantic. So the scientific perspective basically says it's absolutist. Deviance is absolutely real. It's positivism again. Remember, we're talking about applying science to people. So this perspective says that deviance is absolutely intrinsically real. It's an inborn real quality. It possesses some kind of quality or qualities that say this is not conventional. This does not conform. Deviant people are assumed to have certain characteristics that make them different from people who are conforming or conventional. So sociologists who take the scientific perspective tend to say the deviant behavior is some intrinsic attribute that is part of the person. It's not something that society is labeling, it's inside the person. So it's central to the person rather than the culture. The scientific perspective also takes it as an objective fact that deviance is observable, that we can see it, that deviant behavior is an observable object because we can observe a deviant person. It's a real something. We can study it with an objective eye, not subjective eye. So positivist sociologists are assuming that their studies of deviance can be just as objective and judgment-free as natural scientists are when they study, say, an earthquake, or when they study the structures of a frog, or when they study how a honeybee's hive comes together. So the trick here is to treat deviance as if they were an earthquake, or a mountain, or an ocean, or an animal, just like natural scientists study those things. So not let your feelings or your beliefs get involved in anything you're doing. Another part of the scientific perspective is this idea of determinism, which is deviance as determined behavior by forces that are beyond and outside the control of the individual. This is the free will argument. Earlier sociologists didn't think we had free will, so it would be a lot easier for us to be studied if we didn't have free will. If we all acted in predictable ways and free will wasn't an issue, then it would be a lot easier to categorize us and figure out which ones of us were inherently deviant and which ones weren't. Now, later scientific sociologists generally reject this idea, or at least they say, well, we're not good with saying people don't have free will, but they still say there's an awful lot of stuff that we don't have any control over. And the scientific perspective, when it's talking about deviance, it tends to be talking about the more violent forms that move over the line into criminality. So, assault, theft, rape, murder, these kinds of deviance, a lot of scientists who are in the scientific perspective really want these things to be something we can identify about this person that we can stop, that we can control, that we can cure, to fix the problem of deviance and criminality. Now, the other perspective is the semantic perspective. And the semantic perspective demands relativism, so it's sort of the opposite of the absolutism that the scientific perspective requires. The idea is that deviant behavior, in and of itself, doesn't have any intrinsic deviant characteristics unless we think it does, or we decide it does. So the characteristics aren't tied to what a person's doing. They're tied to people's interpretation of them. It's deviant because we think it's deviant, not because it might actually be factually deviant, but because we as a society have decided it's deviant. The second thing is subjectivism, and again, here's the objectivism opposite. Okay, so in science this would be objectivism, but the semantic perspective says no, deviant behavior is a personal experience. And just because we're seeing what's on the outside doesn't mean we know anything about what's going on the inside. Humans feel, we think, we reflect, and we're not just passive atoms that move in response to outside forces. Which then moves us into this idea of voluntarism, which is the opposite of determinism. In the semantic perspective, we do what we do because we choose to do it. So this is an absolute free will view. The analysis here is not the people who are deviating. Semantic perspective people tend to take the people who are doing the judging and reacting and labeling, and we analyze them. And also, those in power have a lot more free will to do this judging and reacting than most people who are deviant. So the semantic perspective tends to focus on less serious and non-violent forms of deviance because it's staying heavily in the deviance, not criminality realm. Okay, we do have, minor forms of criminality, but nothing that harms people. So these two folks, these two groups, you might think of them as standing at opposite ends of a spectrum because some of them are really die-hard, criminality is an inborn thing and people need to be controlled, and then the other group is criminality is a reaction to your circumstances and other people are judging you. So I want you to make a note. Which camp are you more in right now? Of these two groups, the scientists or the semanticists, which one appeals to you more and why? I want you to think about that and bring that to class with you on Wednesday. Now, here are some different ways in which we've explained deviant behavior, okay, apart from the chronological theories. Emil Durkheim was an early functionalist theorist. He was one of the fathers of sociology. If you've taken theory, you've run into him. And he approached his study of society with the view that society is a social organism, and our job is to heal it and figure out where it's sick and fix the problems. And of course, one of the big issues then would be deviance. In one of his essays called The Normal and the Pathological, Durkheim demonstrates the following things. Number one, the law is the written down codification of the collective viewpoint of what is right and what is wrong. This is also known as the collective conscience. The second thing is that people acting in deviance reinforce the collective conscience and make it even more important for people who are not being deviant. We notice that our norms say doing that is wrong when someone does something wrong. And if we didn't have deviance, we wouldn't have any social change. We might not like it when it's actually happening, but it's necessary or we'll stagnate and die. And a quote here from Durkheim is that crime implies not only that the way remains open to necessary changes, but that in certain cases it directly prepares those changes. That's an unquote. So Erikson is another theorist who shows that human actors are usually and mostly grouped in small clusters called communities. Community members spend a lot of time with each other. They're in close contact with each other. They develop a sense of peoplehood and place, and they maintain boundaries within which we live and they don't. So, for example, think of the Amish. They tend to hold themselves apart from American society. They have their own way of living. Or think of people living in a heavily ethnic community, for example, Little Italy, or Little Tokyo, or Little Israel in Los Angeles. There's an area that's heavily Israeli Jews. So these folks don't tend to spend a lot of time interacting with people who aren't part of us. They stay with us. And a lot of what we just know to be wrong isn't written down anywhere in these communities, or we don't even need it written down just to know that it's wrong. How many people actually know the difference between theft and commercial enterprise? How many have actually seen the written law that says this is theft, this is business, and yet we know the difference between theft and business? We just know. We don't need the whole law. We don't need to read the legal code to know the difference between stealing stuff and doing business. Boundaries are not fixed properties in these communities. They will shift and change with time and needs. But if someone deviates too much, we throw him outside the boundaries. He becomes part of them. And in this way, that maintains our boundaries. We are us and not them. They are the deviants that we throw out of the group. There are three types of norms that you need to know about. You've probably run into them already in other social classes, but let's just go over them real quick. There are folkways, mores, and laws, and I should have put them in that order on the slide. But let's start with folkways. So folkways are if you violate a folkway, you're violating some minor social expectation. So picking your nose in public, for example, would be a violation of a folkway. People are going to get a little bit annoyed and they're going to go, that's really weird. But they're not going to come after you with the full force of the law and stick you in jail just for picking your nose in public. They might say, don't touch anything that they've touched, but other than that, they're not going to come after you. So it's a mild reaction. So that's how you know that the norm you violated is just a folkway. It gets a mild reaction, if anything. A more, on the other hand, is a strong, important norm that people in the society, that most of the people in the society consider as sort of vital to the survival of the society. And if you violate a more, even though it's still not written down, it's still informal, it's very important. And if you violate that, you're going to get a very strong reaction. So a person who, I'm trying to think of a way to explain a more. Okay, so more and more we realize that air pollution is really bad for us and that smokers contribute to it a lot. Someone smoking in public is almost punished with, being run out of town on a rail. It's not just this minor distaste. We are really getting angry with people who smoke these days. It's like when someone lights up a cigarette, it's like, go away. Go 3 blocks away. I don't want to have to breathe your smoke. Where if someone's just sitting and rocking and talking to themselves, we generally just avoid them. They're a little weird. They're violating a folkway of not talking to yourself in public. But more and more today, the smoking thing is becoming a more violation, that you are just not allowed to do that in public. That's really not okay. And then there's the law. And the law is the only one of these three types of norms that is formal. And the law is the thing that is written down and has written down categories of punishment, where if we catch you doing something that's against the law, that isn't just a folkway or a more violation, then you're going to get in real trouble. Because you're going to go to jail, or you're going to pay a fine, or both. You're going to lose some liberty or property because of what you did. That's the law. I want you guys to be aware that when you write down the definitions of this, the more is not the violation. You know that it's a more because of how strongly people react to it being violated. The same way for a folkway, you know that it's a folkway because people don't react very strongly when it's violated. But these things are not the violation of the norm. They are the norms that get violated. So I want you to be very clear on those definitions. Okay? Okay, finally we're going to talk about some theories of deviance, which are both about criminality and about deviance, that have been developed over the years. And again, I strongly recommend that you print out this, or I'm going to provide the PowerPoint slides for you. Print this out so that you have it available, so that you know the basic different theories of deviance. Because again, I'm going to ask you to use these to analyze stuff over the course of the semester, so it would be good to have them to hand. So the first one that we're going to talk about is the strain and anomie school. And this school of thought was created by Merton, and then later Agnew expanded on it. And it says that when people feel strain, or the disconnect between the socially approved goal they're expected to achieve and their access to the socially approved way of getting there, or means, they react in one of 5 possible ways. So these ways involve either rejecting the goal or rejecting the means, or both, accepting the goal and accepting the means, or both, or rejecting both of them and substituting a different goal or means. The particular type that Merton felt was deviant is who he called innovators. They are criminals. They reject the socially approved means because they don't have access to them, but they embrace the socially approved goal, and they go about getting it in ways that are not socially acceptable. This is the micro theory about the individual actors. That's strain. Anomie theory is the macro side, or the big institutional side of this theory, and it says that in the United States, and more generally in the West, we have a real imbalance in our priorities. We prioritize the goal a lot more than we prioritize the means. So a lot of people who get rich by criminal means are still lionized and treated like they're important, even though they broke the law 6 ways from Tuesday. And here we have again that deviance admiration thing that Heckert's talked about. The conflict school is Marx and Engels. It's Marxism. It's applied to crime and deviance. And this argument points out that structural inequality often gives the poor no real choices beyond starve or sin. And an oft repeated motto in this school of thought is the rich get richer and the poor get prison. Multiple authors have contributed to this school of thought. But the upshot is the poor commit crime because their survival demands it. The rich criminalizing what the rich do if the poor are doing it to keep the poor in their place. So this is to maintain class status and to maintain class power. The labeling school is mainly Howard Becker, and it's based on the idea that behaviors only are deviant if society is labeling them that way. So people who conform will look at a behavior and say, that's deviant, and then they label people who do that thing as deviant, and then they determine the distinction between what is deviant and what isn't. Labeling theory is largely looking at the labelers, not the people who got labeled. They're asking, why are these labelers applying that deviant label to someone? You know, who gets to do that? Why do they do that? What's the result of that labeling? You know, what happens as the fallout? Powerful individuals within society, like police, judges, politicians, these folks, religious leaders, they tend to impose the most significant labels. So some of the people who can be labeled include drug addicts, alcoholics, criminals, juvenile delinquents, prostitutes or sex workers, sex offenders, and psychiatric patients, just to mention a few. The consequences of being labeled deviant can be really far-reaching. Social research indicates that people who have negative labels also usually have lower self-esteem. They're more likely to reject themselves, and then they may even act more deviantly because they figure, what's the point? You know, the label may cause them to act more deviant than they would have otherwise. Unfortunately, when people accept other people's labels of them, whether it's a correct one or not, they have a really difficult time changing their opinions of the labeled person. Even if there's evidence that shows them this person does not deserve this label, they might still hold tight to it because they need that label in order to maintain their power. Now, the control school of thought, which was promoted mainly by Hershey and Gottfredson, that's how their names are pronounced, states that it's poor socialization that leads to deviance. So, unlike the schools above it and many other schools, control theory says that conforming is not natural. Deviance is actually what's normal, and we have to socialize people into stop doing that. And until Hershey raised this question, the idea was that the people who don't conform are the oddballs, and he took that idea and flipped it. He turned it on its head. So therefore, if people are deviant, it's mainly because they weren't socialized well. Their mamas and their papas and their societies just didn't raise them right. Finally, learning or socialization theory, which the main school of thought, the main theory in this school of thought is called differential association. It's associated with Edwin Sutherland, not Donald Sutherland. Please make sure it's Edwin Sutherland. And it's learning theory applied to crime and deviance. The basic idea is if you lie down with dogs, you will get up with fleas. If you hang out with gang members, you're more likely to become one. If you were raised in the mafia, chances are good you're going to be a button man. Sutherland's ideas rocked criminology and education at the time because his findings included the fact that when you learn how to be a criminal, it's just the same as learning your ABCs or learning how to repair a car, because learning is learning no matter what you're learning. And this really rocked people because they didn't want people who were criminal to be the same as people who weren't. They really wanted non-deviant people to learn in a totally different way, and they wanted criminality to just be something inborn and not learned. Something that you just do because you do it, not because you learned how. Okay, so on Wednesday, I want you to bring your notes from this lecture and from Monday for the tools that I gave you on Monday. And I want you to bring me 2 questions about the stuff that you've learned in this lecture today. I will see you Wednesday.